In the middle of the Mediterranean, there is a rock that should have been a grave. Malta was small, dry, and alone, a chipped tooth of limestone facing an empire. Across the horizon came its sentence, hundreds of Ottoman sails, a moving forest of masts and cannon. On that rock waited fewer than 9,000 defenders, Knights of St. John, soldiers, dock workers, peasants, barely enough men to guard a city wall. They were not supposed to win. They were supposed to vanish beneath the weight of 40,000. Instead, the island that should have fallen became the place an empire broke. Suleiman the Magnificent ruled an empire that touched 3 seas and humbled kings. Yet the map of his victories still had scars. He remembered Rhodes, the fortress that bled his janissaries white, and the knights he allowed to leave under trucemen he believed would wither in exile. Instead, they became a thorn that never stopped cutting. Every pirate raid they launched, every Ottoman ship they burned, was a whisper that his mercy had been a mistake. He remembered Belgrade's fall, Mohawk's drowning fields, the thunder of his armies rolling across Europe like a rising tide. But he remembered Vienna too, the gates that refused to break, the mud that swallowed his guns, the cold that drove him back while the West breathed again. The dream of a road into Europe had dimmed, but it had not died. It waited for a spark, for a target, for a symbol to crush. Malta became that symbol, a small, insolent rock guarded by the same knights who had escaped him decades earlier, blocking the path to Sicily, Italy, and the heart of Christendom. To leave them standing was to leave his legacy unfinished, and Suleiman was too close to the end of his life to tolerate loose ends. So he summoned an armada and an army worthy of legend, not merely to conquer a fortress, but to close a wound. Malta would fall, or the last page of his empire would be written in failure. A knight of St. John stands on the ramparts, armor dinted, white cross stained with rust and salt, eyes hardened by decades at sea. He is not a wandering noble or a romantic crusader. He is a weapon shaped by centuries of holy war. A sailor priest who has lived his entire life between prayer and blood. Every scar he carries was earned in battles the world has already forgotten. Their order began as healers in the Crusader hospitals of Jerusalem, tending the sick beneath chanting hymns in burning towers. But exile reshaped them, driven from the Holy Land, driven from Cyprus, and finally driven from Rhodes after a siege that scarred every surviving brother. They evolved into something fiercer than knights, professionals of defiance. They learned to fight not as lords, but as a navy of relentless raiders, turning the Mediterranean into a battleground of ambushes and lightning strikes. When Rhodes fell and Suleiman spared their lives, the knights carried that mercy like a brand. They had lost their fortress, their home, their dead, but they had not lost their vow. Wherever they landed next, they would fight the Ottoman Empire until God or the sea swallowed them. Malta became that place, not by destiny, but by necessity. Now they stand on a barren rock with nowhere left to retreat. To yield would be to admit their age has ended. So they grip their swords, tighten their gauntlets, and prepare to prove one last time that relics can still kill. From the sea, Malta rises like a broken blade, jagged, pale, and sun-scorched, a shard of limestone thrust into the heart of the Mediterranean. There are no rivers here, no forests, no gentle valleys, only heat, rock, and harbors carved by wind and time into deep wounds that open towards Sicily, North Africa, and the Levant. It is a crossroads for every ship that dares to rule this sea. Up close, the island feels even harsher. The ground is cracked and thirsty, the cliffs sharp enough to cut bare feet, the air shimmering with the weight of summer fire. But in those cracks the knights have built their salvation bastions, hammered into the limestone, walls grown out of the earth itself, and gun positions overlooking every approach. Birgu and Senglea jut into the water like twin fangs, while Fort St. Vicence, Elmo guards the mouths of the harbors with stubborn cils défiance. Malta should have been a coffin for any army, foolish enough to defend it. Yet the knights turned its cruelty into strength, shaping the island into a fortress of stone and prayer. They knew the Ottomans were not coming to attack a town, but to wrestle the island itself, an island as merciless and unyielding as those who now stand upon it. At first, Malta woke to nothing more than light. A pale dawn spilled over the limestone walls, painting Birgu and Senglea in soft gold, the sea lying smooth and empty beyond the cliffs. Knights walked the ramparts, half-armored, squinting into the glare, hearing only gulls and the slow breathing of the tide. For a moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath. Then a lookout shouted. On the horizon, a dark smudge stained the line where sky met water. It grew, slowly, impossibly, until the specks became sails, and the sails became forests of masts marching across the sea. The calm blue began to vanish under a crawling carpet of wood and canvas and steel. Galleys came first, long and thin, oars biting the water in perfect rhythm. Behind them rolled supply ships heavy with grain, powder, and siege guns the size of houses. Banners snapped in the wind, green, red, and gold, marking the standards of Piali Pasha, Mustafa Pasha, and the other men Suleiman had chosen to break this rock. Beneath the decks waited janissaries and Sipahi cavalry, packed shoulder to shoulder like arrows in a quiver. From the walls, the Maltese watched the sea turn to iron. Women crossed themselves. Children clung to their mothers' skirts and stared, as if watching a storm grow teeth. Even veteran knights felt something cold tighten in their chests. Training could not shrink that horizon. The armada swung into position with frightening discipline, surrounding Malta like a closing fist. Boats splashed down, lines of men waiting ashore, banners driven into the sand as engineers marked out camps in gun batteries. Within hours, tents rose. Trenches began to snake toward the high ground, and cannons were dragged into place overlooking the harbors. When the Ottoman commanders studied the map and looked up at the island's teeth, they pointed to the smallest of them, Fort St. Prases, Elmo deciding that this would be the first stone to break. Fort St. Elmo was the smallest of Malta's teeth. A star-shaped fortress perched on a rocky point between the Grand Harbor and Marsamset. To the Ottomans, it was an obvious first target break. St. Elmo and their fleet could anchor safely beneath its guns. Mustafa Pasha predicted 3, maybe 4 days of fighting. What he found instead was a fortress willing to die slower than any man expected. The bombardment began with a roar that never stopped. Cannons, the size of trees, hurled stone and iron into the fort day and night, shaking its walls until they bled clouds of limestone dust. Inside, knights and Maltese soldiers fought with their ears ringing, their eyes burning, their armor growing hotter beneath the sun and fire. Every hour the fort shrank, stones turning to rubble, angles turning to scars. When the first assaults came, and they came fast, janissaries rushing through smoke, ladders thudding against shattered walls, the defenders met them with pikes, crossbows, and stones torn from the ruins beneath their feet. Bodies piled in the breaches until the living fought atop the dead. Still, the Ottomans were thrown back, stunned that men so few could hold in such ruin. Prisoners taken from St. Plague, Elmo were mutilated and crucified on rafts. Their bodies floated across the harbor toward Birgu. La Valette watched from the walls, face carved in stone, refusing to show fear His reply was as brutal as the message Ottoman heads fired from cannons back across the water. There would be no mercy on this island. Inside St. Elmo, the defenders begged for relief. Many were wounded, missing limbs, fighting with bandaged stumps or tied-up shields. They sent letters to Valette, asking to evacuate before the next assault consumed them. His answer came like a blade hold. As long as God gives you breath. The final assault broke over St. Lake, Elmo like a black sea. Ottoman drums thundered, smoke smothered the sky, and waves of janissaries stormed through the breaches, blown open by mines. The knights fought in the open courtyard, backs to the chapel, striking until their arms failed. One by one they fell, forming a ring of bodies around the last standard of the order. By midday, the fort was silent. The Ottomans found only corpses, men who had fought to the last heartbeat, dying on their feet with swords still in hand. Mustafa Pasha surveyed the ruins and felt victory taste like ash. St. Elmo had taken not 4 days, but a month, bleeding his elite troops and precious time into the dust. The fortress that died standing had bought Malta life, and as the Ottomans turned their gaze toward Birgu and Senglea, they marched forward knowing the island would not be consumed as easily as the map had promised. When St. Elmo finally fell, the Ottomans turned like a wounded animal toward the twin peninsulas of Senglea and Birgu. These were no isolated forts. They were living towns, packed with soldiers, civilians, and the last heartbeat of Malta. If either peninsula broke, the other would fall with it, and the island would bleed out in hours. Mustafa Pasha ordered the full weight of his surviving army toward these narrow spits of land, determined to crush them before reinforcements could arrive from Sicily. The bombardment began anew, heavier than anything St. Elmo had endured. Cannons hurled fire into homes and churches, turning streets into rivers of dust and shattered stone. Tunnels crept beneath the walls like the claws of unseen beasts, erupting in explosions that sent towers folding in on themselves. Every impact felt personal, every tremor, a reminder that the defenders were running out of island to stand on. Then came the assaults. Ottoman infantry surged over pontoons hastily built across the water, flooding the Senglea flank in waves of steel and shouting. Janissaries battered the land walls at Birgu, using the debris of their own dead as footholds to climb higher. More than once they made it onto the ramparts, planting their banners as knights slammed into them with swords slick from the morning's fighting. Valette fought everywhere at once, wounded in the leg, armor cracked and cloak burned to tatters. He moved along the walls like a man denying death itself. He struck men with his own halberd, dragged the wounded to safety, and forced fleeing soldiers back into the line by sheer force of will. Behind him came Maltese civilians carrying stones, water, powder, whatever kept the line from folding. Inside the towns, the fighting became a nightmare of alleys and rubble. Women hauled sandbags through smoke-choked streets, while old men hurled boiling oil from shattered rooftops. Children carried water skins to defenders too exhausted to lift their heads. Every doorway became a barricade. Every courtyard, a charnel house. For the Ottomans, the cost was staggering. Janissary officers screamed for their men to advance, only to watch them hesitate at the memory of St. Elmo and the mountains of corpses choking the approaches. Sipahis dismounted and fought on foot, slipping in the mud and blood that coated the breached walls. Every victory gained in the morning was lost again by sundown. By late summer, the siege felt endless. The air stank of smoke, sweat, and graves. Both armies teetered on the edge of collapse, surviving only through rage, faith, or fear. At Senglea and Birgu, Malta reached its breaking point and somehow refused to break. Valette stood on the broken wall, armor cracked, face blackened by smoke, the rosary wrapped around his wrist like a chain. Below him, the rubble still trembled from the last Ottoman barrage, dust drifting through the crimson dusk like ash from a dying fire. He leaned on his sword for a moment, not from weakness, but to feel the stone beneath his feet, as if anchoring himself to the island he refused to surrender. Around him, knights and Maltese militia watched in silence, waiting for a man who seemed carved from the same rock they defended. He moved among them without guards, stepping over bodies and shattered cannon wheels, speaking in a voice that cut through the smoke. "Look at these walls," he told a group of young Maltese who could barely hold their pikes. "They stand because you stand. If you fall, then let it be forward." His words did not promise rescue, they demanded resolve. When panic flared in Birgu after a breached gate, Valette arrived before anyone else. He struck the fleeing men with the flat of his blade, dragging them back into formation with a fury that burned brighter than the fires around them. "I will execute any man who turns his back," he roared. "Knight or Maltese, it matters nothing. We die together or we live together." Fear sharpened into discipline. Discipline hardened into defiance. At night, when the exhausted garrison lay half asleep on blood-stained stones, he walked the ramparts alone, whispering prayers to the Virgin between the distant thud of Ottoman guns. Many swore they saw him kneel in the open, lit by moonlight and falling embers, unmoving even as cannonballs smashed into the walls nearby. It was not courage alone, but faith raw, unadorned, blazing like a candle in a storm. Men followed that flame because it made them believe they were more than doomed soldiers. In the worst sectors, Valette fought shoulder to shoulder with common militia, lifting banas, carrying powder to the guns. He lifted an old Maltese fisherman by the collar and shoved him into cover during a bombardment. The man would later swear the Grand Master saved him twice that day. Every act, large or small, welded the garrison into something unbreakable. The walls were failing, but the people behind them were not. By late summer, Malta's defenses were little more than shattered stone and stubborn will. But standing atop the ruins, Valette raised his sword toward the Ottoman camp, as if challenging the horizon itself. Behind him formed a last line: knights, militia, women, children bound not by walls, but by the fire he had lit in every heart. Whatever came next, they would meet it together. Dawn came gray and heavy, as if even the sky was too tired to bleed another color. On the Ottoman side, drums beat slow and steady, while men tightened straps and kissed the hilts of their swords. On the walls, Malta's defenders stared into the smoke-hazed plain. Knowing exactly what this silence meant, both armies understood the next few hours would decide whether this rock stood or vanished. The first signal was not sound, but motion or ripple across the enemy lines, banners lifting like a forest in the wind. Then the earth convulsed as mines detonated beneath the bastions, throwing stone, fire, and bodies into the air. Breaches yawned open in the walls, jagged mouths inviting death. Janissaries surged forward with a roar, a black tide crashing against the shattered defenses. The assault smashed into Birgu and Senglea at once. Storming parties clawed up rubble slopes, shields raised against a storm of arrows, bullets, and falling stones. On the parapets, knights and Maltese civilians fought shoulder to shoulder, pikes braced, muskets firing so close, the powder burned their faces. Valette himself stood in the thickest fury, cloak torn, shouting orders and prayers in the same breath. For a time, it seemed the walls might finally break. Ottoman standards appeared on the ramparts, planted in blood, soldiers pouring through gaps like water through a cracked dam. But each time, a counterattack slammed into them half-armored knights, fishermen with axes, boys with daggers driving them back, step by brutal step. Commanders fell, drums faltered, and what began as a charge turned into a struggle to move it all. The roar of the assault slowly thinned into scattered cries. Exhausted janissaries clung to the lower slopes, unwilling to advance into yet another ring of steel and stone. From the walls, the defenders watched in disbelief as the great tide that had filled their world began, inch by inch, to ebb away. When the last trumpet called the Ottomans back, Malta still stood ruined, bleeding, but unbroken, and an empire's advance had snapped against its stones. After the great assault, Malta lay in a stunned half-silence. Smoke drifted above Birgu and Senglea, blurring the line between sky and ruin. Men sat where they had fought, too tired to stand, gripping swords with hands that would not stop shaking. They had not lost, but they had no strength left to win. The first rumor came from a watchman on the far side of the island. Distant sail, he said. Shapes in the haze that did not bear the crescent. No one believed him at first. Hope felt more dangerous than fear. Then more signals came. Flags on hilltops, flashing the same impossible word relief. Out on the water, new ships cut through the waves. Banners of Sicily and Spain clawing at the wind. Armored soldiers crowded their decks, fresh faces, unscarred shields. Drums beating a rhythm that was not Ottoman. The survivors on the walls watched them land as if seeing ghosts step out of the sea. Disbelief slowly rising into a hoarse, broken cheer. For the first time in months, the cross was advancing, not retreating. In the Ottoman camp, the news fell like a hammer. Their own ranks were thin, their powder low, their best men buried beneath Maltese stone. Now a new enemy marched inland, while Malta's dead defenders rose to join them. In that moment, everyone on the island understood the siege was no longer about whether Malta would fall, but how badly the empire would bleed for failing to take it. When the smoke finally blew out to sea, Malta stood scarred, but alive. Streets were lined with rubble and graves. Yet the survivors walked them with the quiet pride of people who had held the line against the world. Valette and his knights rose from the ruins as legends, their names carried across Europe like a spark in dry grass. Even the Ottomans felt the wound. An empire that once feared nothing now knew the taste of limits. In the years that followed, a new city, Valette, rose from the blood-soaked rock, carved as both fortress and memorial. And for centuries after, the world would remember Malta as the island that taught an empire it could break,